The ultimatum: the crystalline ships of the hegemony descended through Earth's atmosphere like falling diamonds, each one larger than a city block, their surfaces refracting sunlight into prismatic rainbows that would have been beautiful if they hadn't represented humanity's potential doom. Commander Sarah Chen stood in the underground command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, her weathered hands gripping the edge of the holographic display table, as she watched the alien armada position itself above Earth's major cities. 37 ships in total, each one capable of reducing a continent to ash, according to the intelligence reports they had managed to gather. Over the past 3 months since first contact, the hegemony had announced themselves, with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, broadcasting their presence across every frequency humanity possessed. They came not as explorers or traders, but as conquerors, who had already decided Earth's fate before even setting foot on its soil. Their message had been simple and devastating in its arrogance. Earth would submit to hegemony rule within 72 hours or face complete annihilation. There would be no negotiations, no treaties, only submission or death. Sarah had spent those 72 hours not in panic but in careful preparation. While world leaders performed their diplomatic theater, buying precious time with endless requests for clarification and translation difficulties that didn't really exist, she had been awakening something that had been sleeping for nearly 2 decades. Project Thunderstrike had been humanity's insurance policy, born from the paranoia that followed the discovery of the first potentially habitable exoplanet. If we could find them, the reasoning went, then they could find us. And humanity had never been good at playing nice with neighbors. The alien delegation had finally agreed to meet in person, though calling it a meeting was generous. It was more of a sentencing hearing. Ambassador Korvax of the hegemony stood 12 feet tall, his elongated frame covered in scales that shifted color with his mood, currently a deep purple that Sarah had learned meant satisfaction. His forearms moved independently as he gestured, addressing the assembled human representatives like a teacher explaining simple math to particularly slow children. The meeting was being broadcast globally, the hegemony's way of ensuring every human understood their new place in the universe. Korvax's voice resonated through the United Nations Assembly Hall, his words translated by the collar device around his neck. The hegemony had conquered 43 species across 17 star systems. Each one had thought themselves special, unique, worthy of independence. Each one had been wrong. Earth would join them as a tributary world, its resources and people serving the greater good of hegemony expansion. Humans would be relocated to mining colonies and agricultural worlds where their primitive but sturdy physiology would be put to better use. Earth itself would be stripped of its rare minerals and its oceans harvested for deuterium. Secretary General Martinez stood to respond, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. He spoke of humanity's desire for peaceful coexistence, of the potential for mutual benefit through trade and cultural exchange. Korvax's scales shifted to yellow, which Sarah recognized as amusement. The alien's upper right arm waved dismissively while his lower left hand pulled up a holographic display, showing Earth surrounded by hegemony vessels. There was no room for negotiation. Humanity had 12 hours to formally surrender or the bombardment would begin. Sarah turned to her team, a collection of military officers and scientists from around the world who had spent the last 2 decades preparing for this exact moment. Project Thunderstrike wasn't just a weapon system. It was a complete reimagining of human warfare, born from the recognition that any spacefaring civilization would have technology far beyond Earth's conventional military. So humanity had chosen not to be conventional. The project had required unprecedented global cooperation, hidden from public view under the cover of climate change mitigation efforts and deep-sea research projects. The first component was the orbital defense grid, disguised as a network of weather satellites and communication relays. Each one housed a directed energy weapon powered by miniaturized fusion reactors, technology reverse-engineered from crashed objects that various governments had been hiding for decades. The second component was more ambitious, a series of mass drivers hidden in mountain ranges around the world, capable of launching projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. But the crown jewel of Thunderstrike was something far more devious. Dr. Wei Liu, the project's chief scientist, pulled up the readiness reports on his tablet. Every system showed green. The nanite swarms they had seeded in the upper atmosphere were dormant but ready, waiting for the activation signal. The electromagnetic pulse generators built into major cities' power grids were charged. The quantum entanglement communication system that would allow instantaneous coordination between defense points was online. Humanity appeared defenseless, but it was an illusion as carefully crafted as any magic trick. As Korvax continued his speech about the superiority of hegemony civilization and the futility of resistance, Sarah noticed something in his bearing that made her smile grimly. The alien was completely relaxed, his guard down, his ships in a formation optimized for intimidation rather than combat. They had made the classic mistake of assuming that a species confined to one planet must be primitive, that the absence of visible warships meant the absence of weapons. They had no idea that humanity had spent its entire history perfecting the art of war against itself, becoming exceptionally creative at finding new ways to destroy enemies. The 12-hour deadline was perfect. It would be night over the Pacific when it expired. The hegemony ships positioned exactly where the simulations had predicted they would be. Sarah sent the coded message to Martinez, who nodded slightly as he read it on his phone. The Secretary General stood again, his voice carrying a different tone this time, one that made Korvax's scales flicker uncertainty for the first time. Martinez spoke of humanity's long history, of our tendency to surprise those who underestimated us, of our remarkable ability to adapt and overcome. He asked for one final thing: that Korvax allow Earth to respond to the ultimatum with a demonstration of why humanity deserved to remain free. Korvax's laughter filled the assembly hall, a sound like grinding glass that made everyone wince. A demonstration? What could humanity possibly demonstrate that would change the inevitable? His species had achieved faster-than-light travel when humans were still figuring out agriculture. But his amusement was tinged with curiosity, the fatal flaw of advanced species who had forgotten what desperation could drive a people to achieve. He agreed, gesturing magnanimously with all four arms. Earth had 1 hour to provide this demonstration. Sarah's fingers flew across her command console, activating systems that had been dormant for so long that some of the operators had never seen them live. Around the world, hidden facilities came online. The mass drivers in the Himalayas, Rockies, and Andes began their charging sequences. The orbital defense grid shifted imperceptibly, weapon systems acquiring targets while maintaining the appearance of simple satellites. The nanite swarms in the atmosphere began to wake, their microscopic forms designed to devour specific alloys that human intelligence had identified in captured hegemony probe fragments. But the real surprise was happening in the oceans. Humanity had learned long ago that water was an excellent shield against detection, and the trenches of Earth's seas had hidden the construction of something unprecedented. Not ships in the traditional sense, but modular weapons platforms that could separate, recombine, and adapt to any threat. They rose now from the depths, breaking the surface in coordinated emergence that had been practiced in simulations thousands of times. Each platform bristled with railguns, missile systems, and defensive countermeasures that looked crude compared to hegemony technology but operated on principles the aliens had likely never encountered. The demonstration began exactly 1 hour after Korvax's agreement. It started small, almost gently. A single orbital defense satellite fired a low-powered laser burst that painted one of the smaller hegemony vessels. Not enough to damage it, but enough to trigger its shields. The aliens' response was immediate and predictable, their weapon systems coming online with an electric whine that could be heard even through the atmosphere. But as they prepared to retaliate, every screen in the assembly hall and every hegemony ship display showed the same image. Earth, surrounded not by 37 alien vessels, but by over 3,000 human defense platforms, weapon systems and combat satellites that had appeared as if from nowhere. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she watched Korvax's scales cycle through colors so quickly they became a blur. The trap had been set, baited, and sprung. Humanity had learned from its history that the best defense was making your enemy doubt everything they thought they knew. The hegemony had expected to find a primitive world begging for mercy. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by a species that had turned paranoia and preparation into an art form. The real demonstration was about to begin, and Sarah suspected that after today, the hegemony would think very carefully before threatening another primitive world. The reckoning. The silence in the United Nations Assembly Hall was absolute as Korvax stared at the displays showing Earth's hidden defenses. His scales had settled on a color Sarah's xenobiology team hadn't catalogued yet, a deep indigo shot. Through with silver veins that pulsed with his heightened heart rate, the alien ambassador's forehands clenched and unclenched in what she recognized as a fight-or-flight response. For the first time since the hegemony's arrival, the 12-foot-tall alien looked small. Sarah initiated the second phase of Thunderstrike. From her command center, her voice calm as she spoke into the global defense network, every human military asset worldwide moved in perfect synchronization, a choreographed dance of destruction that had been rehearsed in countless simulations. The ocean platforms locked onto their targets with technologies that seemed primitive, but were devastatingly effective. Kinetic weapons didn't care about energy shields designed to stop lasers. Simple projectiles fired at sufficient velocity could overcome any defense if you understood the physics well enough. The first railgun burst came from a platform in the Pacific, a tungsten rod accelerated to 15% of light speed that struck the Hegemony flagship's shield with the force of a nuclear weapon. The shield held, but the impact sent the massive vessel spinning, its graceful crystalline structure suddenly ungainly as its pilots fought to regain control. Before they could stabilize, 3 more platforms fired, their shots timed to hit in sequence, each impact driving the ship further off balance until its shield generators overloaded with a flash that lit up the night sky like a second sun. Korvax's voice over the communication channels was no longer condescending. His translator struggled with the emotion in his words as he demanded an explanation, threatened immediate retaliation, promised the complete annihilation of Earth's population. But his threats rang hollow now. The Hegemony ships were scrambling to reform their formation, but they were fighting an enemy they didn't understand. Humanity hadn't built its defenses to match alien technology. We had built them to exploit every possible weakness that arrogance and overconfidence created. The nanite swarms activated next, invisible clouds of molecular machines that had been drifting dormant in the stratosphere for months. They descended on the Hegemony vessels like microscopic locusts, programmed to consume specific alloys that human scientists had identified and recovered alien materials. The proud crystalline ships began to develop patches of discoloration, their perfect surfaces pitting and scarring as billions of nanites ate away at their hulls. The aliens' energy weapons were useless against an enemy too small to target, their shields unable to stop particles that were already inside their barrier when it formed. Martinez stood at the podium in the assembly hall, his voice carrying across every communication channel as he addressed both humanity and the Hegemony. He spoke of Earth's history of warfare, not with pride, but with grim acknowledgement. Humans had spent millennia perfecting the art of destruction, turning violence into a science when the Hegemony was still learning to reach the stars. We had nuclear weapons when we barely had computers, had theorized antimatter bombs before we had smartphones. The message was clear. Humanity might be young by galactic standards, but we were old hands at war. The electromagnetic pulse struck next, not from Earth's weapons but from the power grids of major cities that had been specifically modified for this moment. The coordinated surge of electromagnetic energy washed over the lower orbiting Hegemony vessels, and while their shielding protected them from the worst effects, their sensors went blind for crucial seconds. In those seconds, humanity's orbital defense grid opened fire with everything they had. Lasers, particle beams, and kinetic impactors converged on the temporarily defenseless ships. 3 Hegemony vessels simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the concentrated fire of hundreds of hidden weapons. Sarah watched the tactical display with professional detachment, noting how the alien fleet's formation continued to deteriorate. They had trained for conquest, not for desperate battle against an enemy that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. The Hegemony fought with energy weapons and shields, with faster-than-light communications and artificial intelligence. Humanity fought with tricks, traps, and the kind of vicious creativity that came from a species that had spent its entire existence finding new ways to kill itself and had gotten very, very good at it. The mass drivers fired in sequence, mountains, themselves becoming weapons as they launched projectiles that had been prepared years in advance. Each shot was calculated not just to hit, but to force the Hegemony ships into predictable evasion patterns. Like herding sheep, Sarah thought, as she watched the alien vessels dodge directly into the firing solutions of the orbital grid. The hegemony's superior technology meant nothing when they were fighting humanity's battle on humanity's terms. We had turned our entire planet into a weapon, and they had flown right into the barrel. But the hegemony hadn't conquered 43 species by giving up easily. Korvax's flagship, despite the damage it had sustained, began coordinating a counterattack. Energy beams lashed down at Earth's surface, targeting the sources of the mass driver fire. Mountains exploded, million-ton avalanches triggered by the tremendous force of the alien weapons. But for every weapon they destroyed, 2 more revealed themselves. Humanity had built redundancy into redundancy, backup systems for backup systems, because we knew that in war everything that could go wrong would go wrong. The battle raged for 6 hours, neither side able to claim a decisive advantage. The hegemony's technology was superior, but humanity's preparation and willingness to accept losses that would have appalled a civilized species kept the fight balanced. Cities burned where alien weapons had broken through, but for every human installation destroyed, an alien ship bore new scars. The crystalline fleet that had descended in perfect formation was now scattered across Earth's orbit, individual ships fighting for survival rather than conquest. It was Dr. Wei Liu who provided the decisive moment. From his position in the command center, he activated Thunderstrike's final protocol, something so dangerous that it had required unanimous agreement from every world leader to implement. Hidden in the asteroid belt, humanity had placed its most terrible weapon. A series of mass drivers loaded not with tungsten rods but with containers of antimatter, painstakingly produced over 2 decades and stored in magnetic bottles. The amount was tiny by cosmic standards, barely a few kilograms total, but when properly deployed it would be enough. The antimatter weapons launched silently, their trajectory taking them on a long arc that would bring them to Earth in precisely calculated intervals. Sarah opened a channel to Korvax's flagship, her face appearing on screens throughout both fleets. She spoke quietly, without threat or boast, explaining what was coming. The hegemony had minutes to make a choice. Leave Earth's system immediately, or face weapons that would make everything they had seen so far look like fireworks. She showed them the trajectory calculations, the energy release predictions, the casualty estimates that included significant human losses that Earth was prepared to accept. Korvax appeared on the return transmission, his scales now a pale green that indicated something like respect mixed with fear. He asked a single question that would be remembered in the histories of both species. Why would humanity risk destroying itself to avoid conquest? Sarah's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. Because we had spent our entire history conquering each other, and we knew what it meant to lose freedom. Death was preferable to chains, even gilded alien ones. The first antimatter container entered Earth's atmosphere as Korvax made his decision. The hegemony fleet, battered and depleted, began its withdrawal. Not in panic, but in ordered retreat, maintaining what dignity they could as they abandoned the field. The container was remotely destroyed before detonation, its antimatter safely dispersed in the upper atmosphere in a flash of pure energy that served as humanity's final statement. We could have destroyed everything, but we chose not to. We were not barbarians, but we were not prey either. As the last hegemony ship disappeared beyond Luna's orbit, Sarah finally allowed herself to slump in her chair. Earth had survived its first real test, but at tremendous cost. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead or displaced, and the planet's infrastructure would take decades to rebuild. But humanity was free. And more importantly, the galaxy now knew that the small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system was not to be taken lightly. The hegemony would spread the word among the stars. Earth was a world of warriors who had turned their own planet into a fortress and would rather die than kneel. Secretary General Martinez addressed the world that night, standing in the ruins of New York City with the twisted remains of a hegemony fighter visible behind him. His words were carried to every surviving corner of Earth and, unknown to humanity at the time, were recorded and transmitted throughout the hegemony's vast communication network. He spoke of victory without celebration, of survival without joy, of the price of freedom measured in blood and rubble. But his final words carried hope. Humanity had looked into the face of a galactic empire and hadn't blinked. We had proven ourselves not through superior technology but through superior will. In the depths of space, aboard his damaged flagship, Ambassador Korvax compiled his report for the Hegemony Council. His recommendation was unprecedented in their history of conquest. Earth should be quarantined, marked as too dangerous to approach, and left to develop on its own. The humans were not ready for the galaxy, he wrote. But more importantly, the galaxy was not ready for the humans. They were a species that had weaponized their entire world, that treated mutually assured destruction as a valid negotiating tactic, that would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. The battle for Earth became known throughout the galaxy as the Day of Thunder, when a primitive world had stood against an empire and won through sheer bloody-minded determination. But for humanity, it was simply Tuesday. Another day in our long history of facing impossible odds and finding a way to survive. The cleanup began immediately. The rebuilding started before the fires were even out. And somewhere in hidden bunkers, military planners were already working on Thunderstrike 2. Because if there was one thing humanity had learned, it was that there was always a bigger threat on the horizon.